presentation outlines how to convert a lawn space over into a nice, beautiful, productive garden space with beautiful beds like this laid out in these pictures. The most conventional method that people would usually use when converting a lawn over to a garden would be by tilling it. Tilling is just the action of churning up the soil, usually with some kind of machine like a rototiller or a rototiller on the back of a tractor for doing all that work. Though you could do it by hand with just some hose and keep on whacking at the soil. The first step when tilling that's usually helpful is to first remove the sod to dig out that carpet of grass, and then you can go through with a rototiller and churn it up, as the second picture indicates. But even if you do that, there's still going to be some work needed for probably removing some grass clods out or other large clods. So tilling can be a lot of work to establish a garden, and it's something that you'll need to repeat year after year after year if you just keep that bare soil there. So I'm going to move on to a different method though. And that different method is the no-till method for establishing a garden space. So this is a little less well known. Like I said, it's not as conventional as tilling, but hopefully you'll find this method interesting and compelling. So what you would do if you're not going to churn up the soil is first you would just take your lawnmower and you'd scalp mow, which just means you're going to mow it really, really low if you can. The next thing that you can do, it's optional, is you just go in and you take a broad fork or a digging fork. That's just like a really thick pitchfork type thing that you then thrust into the soil and you rock it back to try to aerate the soil and loosen it up some. And then, so you imagine you've got some really short grass. You can then just take some kind of a covering. You'll need to gather a lot of cardboard, maybe from a local business or something like that, and you'd cover that whole space with some newspaper, like maybe a couple layers of that, or some cardboard, and you'd have to keep it wet in order to keep it in space, in place. After that, you would need to apply a pretty thick layer, about 4 inches of mulch on top of that wet cardboard. Now you need to do this directly after applying the cardboard onto that space because it'll dry out really fast, within minutes really. So you're kind of running the hose over it constantly, and then you apply that thick layer of mulch. And then after that, all you would need to do is just kind of mark out where your planting beds are. I'll talk a little bit more about planting beds in a few slides, and where your walking pathways are, and then you kind of have the general layout of what your garden is supposed to look like. And before I get into that last step, I want to talk a little bit about mulch and the no-till system and why it can be really great. One of the benefits of going no-till is that you're not constantly churning up the soil and disturbing all the microorganisms that live within the soil. And mulch has the great benefit of retaining moisture in the soil. It kind of keeps it covered. It's a protective blanket. And there are many more benefits. It can kind of stabilize the temperature and insulate the soil a little bit more, which some people will note as a disadvantage in the spring when they want the soil to warm up faster so that they can plant sooner. But it has its pros and cons. Overall, I think it's a nice way for maintaining the stability and the health of the soil rather than constantly churning it up. And I also want to note that there are many different things you could use for mulch. You could use leaves. That's a nice, easy, free resource that's often just sitting at the side of the curb in the fall. You could gather free leaf bags from your neighbors. Or you could use hay or straw or even wood chips. As long as you don't incorporate those wood chips into the soil, they're not going to tie up nutrients for the plants that you're going to be planting. And now I just want to get back to that sixth little picture right there where it talks about adding a 2 to 4 inch little section of compost in wherever plants are going to be placed. So some people, when they're talking about doing no-till, they just advocate for putting a whole layer of compost down in their planting bed, at least like an inch thick. And they're using that as a sort of mulch, because compost could be referred to as mulch as well. It's just broken down organic material. And all the mulch that you lay down in a no-till system will eventually just break down. It's going to look like compost. That's the other great thing about mulch, is you're constantly adding on nutrients and you're making your soil richer and richer. So when you're starting off though, that's a lot of compost. If you're trying to ship in enough compost to cover an entire planting bed, that could get really expensive. So one thing you could do is you could just put a little pocket of compost wherever you want to plant your seeds or your transplants. So just as that picture shows, you could just kind of scooch the mulch off to the side, put a nice little layer of compost right there, and then when you put your transplant there or you put some seeds there, the roots will then just grow down through that wet cardboard that stays wet and moist. And that cardboard will also break down over time. You only need to apply the cardboard in the first year, and then in successive years, all you need to do to maintain your no-till space is every fall or spring, you add another nice thick layer of mulch over that space. So admittedly, a no-till system is kind of trading one type of work for another. When you're tilling, you have to churn up the soil every single spring. And sometimes that can be difficult because it's wet and it's hard to get in the garden early in the spring. But when you're doing no-till, you can start earlier because you don't have to wait to till until the soil dries out. And you have to have a source for a lot of organic matter. But if you're okay going that route and just picking up leaves from your neighbors, it can be a great method for you. I also just want to note quick, if you are going to go no-till, a great source for compost is to just go to a local landscape business. You can buy it at bulk much cheaper than you would be able to just going to a regular garden shop. So you might need to put a tarp in the back of your vehicle, or maybe you could get it delivered, but that's a great way to get bulk compost. I also want to note that it would be a great idea to use fertilizer within your garden as you're preparing your space. So you could lay the fertilizer down even before you lay down your mulch layer on top of some of that wet cardboard, or you could even just put it underneath the cardboard. Either way, it doesn't matter a great deal, but here's a little list of a few different fertilizers that you could consider. I really recommend some soybean meal. It's a nice balanced fertilizer, and of course there's lots of different fertilizers that you could use for lots of different plants, but it would be great to employ some of them within your space rather than just counting on the compost, especially if you're using the compost more sparingly, as I was recommending earlier. But if you lay an entire bed in like an inch layer of compost, that would provide all the nutrients that you would need for your garden space. So as a bit of an overview here, I just want to outline, these are some of the materials that you would need if you were going to be establishing a no-till space. So again, you'll see that it's really organic materials intensive. You're going to need a lot of leaves or straw. You could even use grass clippings as mulch, as I mentioned before, wood chips. But in your space, you're going to need access to ready water. You're going to need that fertilizer, cardboard, newspaper, and you can see the list kind of goes in the order that I was just speaking about from top to bottom there, even though I just went from bottom to top. But otherwise, the twine and the stakes that you see there on the right, those would be helpful for marking out the beds that you eventually want to create. And speaking of beds, you maybe noticed that I've been using that term of garden beds, but where does that term come from? Well, it's you can kind of think of beds as the same way that people speak about growing within raised beds. They create order and definition within the garden, so everyone knows where to walk in the pathways and where not to walk, which is, you don't want to walk in the beds. You want to keep those spaces nice and fluffy. You don't want to be compacting them down with your feet. So just walk in the pathways. So a lot of people will organize their growing beds into rectangular spaces, like in this illustration here. This can be really helpful for setting up simple irrigation systems, especially if you start to use drip tape, also called drip irrigation. And the bed and the path widths can of course vary according to your personal preference, but just keep in mind that the wider your pathways, the less space you have for growing vegetables. You don't want to make your beds too wide either, since you'll need to reach into the middle of each bed without stepping into it. Remember, you don't want to step in there. You just want to keep your feet in the paths. So another tip here is to make any beds that run along the fence border of your garden about half the width of other beds, since you'd only be able to access that bed by reaching to it from one side, since you have a fence on the other. And that's also reflected in this picture above. But a kind of a standard width for mini beds would be around 3 feet wide, and paths could be a foot and a half wide, or wider if you want a more luxurious space to kind of wind in between. But that's just one design you can see right there, and everybody has their own personal preference for how they'd like to lay out their space. But it can be helpful to sketch that out in advance of the season on graph paper. That's an easy way to have each square represent 1 foot, for instance, and to lay it out in your mind. So, and it's easy to print off graph paper online or something like that. But whatever you do, I'm sure it'll be great. So I hope you find this video helpful, and I'll see you next time.